Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to see everyone here today. My name is Megan Jacobs, and I'm an associate professor here in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico. And today is part of a series of monthly public lectures for the UNM Honors College Discovery Series, which highlight a range of scholars and their unique research and methodologies. While some of us are physically in New Mexico or on campus, I know others are sprinkled geographically all over the country. Meg is joining us from Texas, and Francis is joining us from New York. I would like to begin, however, by giving an acknowledgement of the original peoples of the land in which the University of New Mexico sits. The Sandia Pueblo and the Navajo Nation have ties and stories on this land, and we honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of it, and acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize this history. And just a little bit of housekeeping. This particular presentation is being recorded with the intention of placing the documentation on the Honors College website. So if you prefer not to have your likeness be recorded, feel free to turn off your video. It's in the bottom left corner there. So today I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, Meg Griffiths and Francis Jakubek, co-founders of a Yellow Rose Project, which is a photographic collaboration of responses, reflections, and reactions to the 19th Amendment from over 100 different women across the United States. This year marks the centennial anniversary of women's right to vote. As many of you have seen, the UNM Honors College is pleased to have a subset of this series of images from the Yellow Rose Project on view in an exhibition in Spectre Gallery. Today, Francis and Meg will be sharing how they kind of conceived of this idea for the Yellow Rose Project and the works that were contributed by contemporary female artists from across the US. I'd like to say just a couple of words about each of the founders. Meg Griffiths earned her Master's of Fine Arts in Photography from Savannah College of Art and Design and is currently an assistant professor of photography at Texas Women's University. Meg's photographic research explores domestic, economic, historic, and cultural relationships across the southern United States and Cuba. Her work has traveled widely and is placed in collections such as the Center for Creative Photography, the Capital One Collection, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. She received the Margaret Cameron Award for Best Fine Art Series in 2017 and the second place prize at Photo NOLA in 2019. Francis Jakubek is a photographer, a curator, and an advocate for photography. She's the director of exhibitions and operations at Bruce Silverstein Gallery in New York City and a former associate curator at the Griffin Museum of Photography. Her photographs have been exhibited at the Southern Contemporary Gallery in Charleston, South Carolina, Filter Space in Chicago, Illinois, and the Hess Gallery at Pine Manor College in Massachusetts. Jakubek has been a speaker for the Photo Brigade and a juror for exhibitions throughout the US, including the United Photo Industries Defense and Photo District News's The Curator Awards. Please join me in welcoming these two incredible artists in their own right and the co-founders of a Yellow Rose Project, Meg Griffiths and Francis Jakubek. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. We appreciate you all for being here, but also appreciate you so much for housing part of the work and also being a part of the project itself. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and show you a little slideshow, give you some history, how we came to the project, but also we're going to pick out some specific images from the show to talk about various themes and issues that are sort of like entangled and covered within the project. All right, so August 18, 2020 marked the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, stating the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It was on that day women wearing yellow roses stood shoulder to shoulder in Tennessee, awaiting the roll call of men that would cast their votes for or against a woman's right to a voice in government. The bright flower was a small outward symbol of their expression to gain equal representation. After decades of untold risk through oppression, brutality, incarceration, and even starvation, these women fought against insurmountable odds to gain the right to be a part of the democratic process. And it all came down to one vote, one letter written from one mother, Phoebe Ensminger Byrne, to her 24-year-old son, Harry, a newly elected state legislator. She wrote for all women, imploring him, her good boy, to vote for ratification and give women the freedom to choose, participate, and be heard alongside men. Grasping that letter while wearing the red rose of opposition, he stood up and with his 3 letters said "I" and ended years of ceaseless struggle for specifically white women.
And though this movement granted rights to some women, and this achievement itself is to be acknowledged and commemorated, the struggle did not end there. It was not until much later that all American women, regardless of race, were given the same privilege. Due to state laws and prohibitive policies, many women of color were unable to exercise their rights, even given this momentous event. In light of these facts, we look back upon this part of our history from various perspectives, inviting both a critical eye as well as one that sees how far we have come. Lisa Tetrol, author of The Myth of Seneca Falls, Memory in the Women's Movement, writes, "What we remember, what we forget matters. That in looking back, even upon remarkable as well as troubled history, we must be thoughtful in the present. In this moment in time, we are meant to honor the historical significance of events such as these, as well as re-examine the narratives that have been shared, rewritten, and erased. It is in part up to women, as creators of our own culture, to shape how we tell and share our history. Finding inspiration in the power of these women to shape and influence both personal and public perception when gathered for a higher calling, we launched this photographic collaboration, a Yellow Rose project. We invited photographers sourcing from our own personal networks and with suggestions from other respected women in the field to submit 5 photographs that directly or indirectly reflect, react, or respond to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Interpretation of this was completely left up to the artists. And the goal of a Yellow Rose project is to provide a focal point and platform for these image makers across the US to respond to the centennial of this event, bridging the past, present, and the future. Ultimately, 105 photographers submitted work in response.
So the exhibition selected for the Honors College at the University of New Mexico presents a contemporary collection of expression prompted by this troubled yet remarkable historical event. The images speak to the movement leading up to ratification, the legacy we have inherited because of it, and the work we will continue to do as a result of it. Some images draw upon personal histories and share with us a glimpse into the present lived experience. This can be seen through intimate portraits of others or the self, domestic spaces, protest scenes, and documentation of the here and now. Other visuals use archival images, news clippings, or writing to speak about erasure, recovery, and remembering. Themes surrounding the body and gesture come into play in various ways, alluding to issues of power, sexuality, choice, vulnerability, and endurance. We also see generations of women represented and connected, whether that be within the images or by those who authored them. The resulting body of work imbues the power, responsibility, and unique complication of being a woman in the United States from a kaleidoscope of viewpoints. The exhibition aims to show the undeniable strength and resiliency we possess as a whole when united for a higher purpose. So the seed for this project really took root back when I began working at Texas Women's University in 2017, and the day I stepped foot onto campus. There's a large statue just outside the front door of the Fine Arts Building of a tall, muscular, marbled woman, pioneer period dress with boots, her left hand lifted to her heart. Her eyes do not cast down, but out ahead, looking northwest. The statue's name, Minerva, which derived from various root translations, simply means intelligent. In Roman myth, Minerva is the goddess of wisdom, the arts, and war. Learning a bit about this history upon my arrival, the connection of a wise warrior's name placed upon an intrepid pioneering woman, and a newly acquired position on the heels of the 2016 election, wove time, women, and my own experience together that seemed an endless source of inspiration for me. The power of being around women, myth, metaphor, or reality. I just knew right away that I wanted to create a large-scale photographic project with women. But it wasn't until I met Frances and we got together in New York in April of 2019, just after APAD, that things began to take shape and momentum.
I was so excited to work with Meg on something monumental like this. We always knew it would be a big project, incorporating voices of as many artists that would agree to participate with us. I remember the format taking a few iterations before we came to the plan to invite artists to make photographs specifically in response to the 19th Amendment, not utilizing images that have already been created. It was always about choice, about coming together to strengthen our individual voices as a collective. And why concentrate on a project on the 19th Amendment? We knew the centennial was approaching, and we were interested to see how our colleagues would respond, coming from different backgrounds and places that they were at in their careers.
We also knew from the outset that we wanted to share varied visions. So we wanted women of culture, women of all ages, women at all stages of their careers, and to be a part of this project. In order to have a rich and thoughtful response to this anniversary, which again was not an anniversary for all to celebrate, we wanted to invite a diverse group of women whose perspectives would not be the same. Choosing to make work about this complicated anniversary and asking for women to step away from other important work to do this now, well, that is the right of every woman to decide how they would like to spend their time, labor, and energy. Just because we asked women to participate does not mean there was always a yes on the other end. There are a number of reasons for this. We were essentially commissioning women to make work, and the only thing we could offer in return was our time, labor, and energy to work for them. So it went into trying to find ways to promote and share the work, creating opportunities like shows, a book, and a place to house the work in a virtual archive. This was something we offered in exchange for creative content, so there's no money exchanged here. Right now we have in our country a lot of really important projects and a lot of work to do, and honestly a lot of work to undo. So making or not making work, this project was all about the right to choose to be a part of it.
I'm gonna let this slideshow go just for another like 40 seconds or so everybody could see a picture from each of the participants, which has been a really important part of us carrying this show around. So the selection we have at UNM is accompanied by the slideshow that is really inclusive of everybody who put their time and energy into this, which we've done our best to make that true and inclusive in whatever format it's shown. So this has like a few more seconds to go. So we wanted to highlight a few of the images that are on view at UNM and others from the archive to discuss themes. This picture is by Cindy Wang, and her series is called The Forgotten Suffragette, which resurfaces newspaper clippings about 4 women activists, but obscures their portraits, which she refers to as a visual indication of our collective, racially inflected forgetting. The piece on view in the gallery is from Mabel Pingwa Lee. Lee was a known figure in New York's suffrage movement by the time she was 16 years old. Her May 1914 essay, while she was attending Barnard because Columbia would not accept women students, argued that suffrage for women was necessary to a successful democracy. The extension of democracy through voting and the equality of opportunities to women were the hallmarks of true feminism. Covered by the New York Times, her speech in 1915, The Submerged Half, urged the Chinese community to promote girls' education and women's civic participation. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women throughout the country the right to vote, but not all women in the US benefited. The federal law, the Chinese Exclusion Act, in place from 1882 to 1943, limited Chinese immigration and prevented Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens. Without US citizenship, Lee could not vote. Yet she and other Chinese suffragists advocated for women's voting rights, even though they did not benefit from the legislation. And it's still unknown if Lee ever voted. Next, we have Susan K. Grant, and she shares with us a series of shadow portraits inspired by history and the life stories of suffragists. The work gives voice to history not taught in most schools and identifies women from diverse geographic locations and backgrounds. The final images consist of digitally painted portraits combined with patterned shadowed backgrounds built and photographed in her studio. In studying the archival images, she takes artistic liberty to determine what she imagined as appropriate hairstyles and clothing for the time period. Next, she creates custom-built backdrop of shadows assembled from an assortment of found objects and fabrics specifically chosen to evoke the essence of each suffragist. This particular portrait referencing Mary Church Terrell. Terrell was a prominent figure in the suffrage movement, which she saw as essential to elevating the status of Black women and consequently the entire race. She actively campaigned for Black women's suffrage and even picketed the Wilson White House with members of the National Women's Party. In 1909, Terrell was among the founders and charter members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Then in 1910, she co-founded the College Alumni Club, later renamed the National Association of University Women. Terrell fought for women's suffrage and civil rights because she realized that she belonged to, quote, to the only group in this country that has two such huge obstacles to surmount, both sex and race. And repurposing photographs to bring history into a contemporary analysis, artist Tony Pepe explains, these images are time capsules, showing us the event pictured, but also the frame through which they are received. They illustrate movement, both socially and politically, as records of women's liberation and voting rights on a global scale, but also durationally as physical images that were held, touched, and eventually abandoned.
So Letitia Huckabee's piece was made as part of a partnership with over 20 women of color who created their own protest signs that expressed in their own words their work towards suffrage or prayers for the future. The images are printed onto vintage textiles, including sugar sacks, flour sacks, and cotton picking sacks. Huckabee's piece, titled Sugar and Spice, includes an image of her 10-year-old daughter holding a protest sign that says "Enough" in spray paint. Huckabee's work references Norman Rockwell's painting, The Problem We All Live With, in an iconic image of the civil rights movement. Huckabee's image is printed onto a 6-foot cotton picking sack that references slavery, the body as property, and a means to industry. The word "enough" was taken from a speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King's 9-year-old granddaughter, Yolanda Renee King, at the March for Our Lives rally in Washington, D.C. in 2019, where she stated, "My grandfather had a dream that his 4 children would not be judged for the color of their skin, but for the content of their character. And I have a dream that enough is enough, and that this should be a gun-free world, period."
In this project, we also see images of younger generations, our country's future voters, by Jennifer Miller, Ashley Coleman, and Rania Matar, who photographed and interviewed women. Many of them are voting for the first time in this upcoming election. And this is Kayla, that is pictured.
I just got on.
From Roxbury, Massachusetts. And she said in her interview with Rania, these are Kayla's words, "Many years ago, my ancestors fought and died for my right to vote. Black men and women sacrificed everything so I could have the chance and choice to vote how I actually want to live my life. When it comes to voting, matters of feminine health pertaining to rape and abortion rights and laws that affect women every day affect me every day. Not voting makes it one step closer for a white man I've never met that particularly doesn't care for my rights solely because I am Black and also a woman, to then decide for me what I can and cannot do with my reproductive parts. Just then later to publicly and deliberately joke about grabbing me by them. I vote to have a word." Other works in a Yellow Rose project employ hand-sewing elements that allude to women's work and the subversive stitch. Elevating and reclaiming the female form through hand manipulation and intent, Marina Font, whose work explores ideas about identity, gender, territory, language, and the forces of the unconscious, transforms the image of a human body into something mythological and everlasting. Diane Mayer explains her hand-stitched piece in her own words. Given Maxine Waters' strength and unapologetic outspokenness in raising the morale and ethical impunities of the current administration and her consistent calls for impeachment, I wanted to create a piece that references her recent media appearances, especially as her voice has become inspirational for a growing younger generation. My piece centers around a quote from Maxine Waters from a television interview on MSNBC. I'd like to say to women out there, don't allow these dishonorable people to intimidate you or scare you. Be who you are. Do what you do.
So Gail Samuelson photographed garments that belonged to her mother and her aunt, who worked in the manufacturing business in a time where few women held their positions. The images are metaphors for the toughness and resilience of women, for the suffragists whose hard-fought fight led to the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and for all women who continue to work tirelessly for parity in the workplace, in government, and at home. Hand-sewn hems, solid pleats, and worn sleeves represent the competence and grit of their generation and of every generation of women who continue to work towards equality for all. Various artists also chose to connect with particular women in history and use archival images as well as historic photographic processes, such as the cyanotype, which was created in 1842, to connect personally to this topic of women's progress and raising awareness and consciousness after the war. Rachel Phillips focused on one such remarkable woman named Frances Benjamin Johnston, who was an early American photographer and photojournalist whose career lasted for almost half a century. She is most known for her portraits, images of Southern architecture, and various photographic series featuring African Americans and Native Americans in the turn of the 20th century. Phillips states, in looking back 2 decades before the 19th Amendment passed, I realized how that particular moment sits in a historical continuum. Women worked to become self-realized and equal members of society long before suffrage, and an ambiguity, imperfection, and struggle toward that ideal it still exists today, 100 years on.
Another artist that is utilizing the cyanotype process is Edie Bressler, who describes her process as combining collaboration with chance encounters. This piece is made by using a light-sensitive cyanotype emulsion and the participation of her local community. Mothers, children, and co-workers having lunch outside helped her create the silhouettes of hands playing tug-of-war with string and sticks. After processing the image, Bressler drew on the piece with crayon to echo the sashes worn by women marching. Bressler remarks on the colors, purple, yellow, and instead of white, I chose green. Green represents the hope for a more equitable future.
So various themes that emerged reference women's empowerment as well as impediment through objects. Yvette Meltzer's sanitary belt is one such example of women's ingenuity and innovation as much as women's liberation. She chose to photograph this object as seemingly nondescript looking white belt upon a red backdrop, alluding to the 100th anniversary of the invention of the sanitary belt, which coincided with the 19th Amendment centennial. As Meltzer so succinctly puts it, the sanitary belt allowed women to move about while menstruating. In the same year women were given the vote, Mary B. Kenner, an African-American woman, crafted a sanitary belt that kept a pad secured in a waterproof pocket. Inspired by her invention, companies like Kotex copied her, and menstrual pads as we know them were born. She was stunned, Meltzer was stunned, she noted, to learn of how primitive menstrual products were 100 years ago, rags, clumps of grass, sponges. However, she was horrified to learn that racism almost prevented Mrs. Kenner's production of her product. Emily Peacock also creates a series of 4 images, each one a metaphor and a declarative statement of sexual power expressed through a soft pastel palette with sensual undertones. A nod to the woman's body being both a pillar and a sanctuary, it also speaks to objects of sexual liberation and autonomy over one's own pleasure. Katie Benjamin's Examination in Pink, a case study, examines gender equity in various spheres, from the military to our highest official office, the presidential seat in the White House. Each object chosen is sprayed pink, making a mark in all spheres where women should be thriving. Recalling words from the late Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who stated, "Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception." Elizabeth M. Claffey uses the vernacular of crime scene photography to visualize the many crimes resulting from the 2016 American presidential election. Through fabricated depictions of aftermath, clothing becomes a metaphor for resistance and evidence of the invisible, as well as visible abuse. White articles of clothing are used as a way to represent the complex power issues and cultural significance of clothing that has been adopted by women in the US throughout history as a symbol of empowerment and autonomy in the face of a government designed to uphold patriarchy. Women wore white in the 1920s as they marched for suffrage, and white throughout history when they, say, for instance, were sworn into office, such as Shirley Chisholm as the first Black woman elected to Congress, or Hillary Clinton when becoming the first Democratic nominee for president, or even more recently, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when being sworn into Congress too, commenting her outfit was a tribute to the mothers of our movement, all those that paved the way for her to achieve this position.
Billy Mandel brings to light the work of Esther Lape, who was an activist and educator who advocated for women's suffrage, healthcare reform, labor rights, and the anti-war movement. She was one of the founders of the League of Women Voters and a close friend to Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1927, she and her life partner, lawyer Elizabeth Reed, built their home at Salt Meadows, Connecticut. In 1972, Lape donated the 147-acre property to the United States Department of the Interior as the first national wildlife refuge in Connecticut. In 1987, Salt Meadows was renamed for U.S. Congressman Stuart B. McKinney. The image is titled Habitat for the Endangered Roses of Plymouth. Other themes we saw were examples of protests, like in the images of Chris Sanford and Caitlin Copenhaver, who focused her work on the arrest of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell through site-specific performance pieces, cloaked in what she refers to as a predator banner. Each work's title beginning with, in reference to the current coronavirus, Epstein is the worst kind of virus. And Greta Pratt, whose photographs place us in a particular moment in time of protest. Another artist actively creating and advocating for the enfranchisement of women is Janine McNabbales, who has been continuously working on a project called Standing Together, which champions Inez Milholland, a figure who was at the forefront of the suffrage movement in the early 20th century.
So one of the larger themes that we saw in the project as images started to roll in, expressed in various ways concerning the body and gesture. So Sarah Hoskins documents a group of African-American hamlets in Kentucky, women who are gathered in a room, hands clasped. As Sarah puts it, there is so much history that has been overlooked and neglected, especially women of color and women-led groups like this one. Let us not forget in this historic anniversary that there were women who worked harder to get much less. Claudia Ruiz Gustafson poetically collages a series of hands reaching up into darkness, while one lone figure on the left floats above, eyes closed as if dreaming, using magical elements to make a point, possibly about history or more recent reality and various protests across the country. The image made by Yael Eben and Bree Suiters is a collaboration between two women about two women. In these gestures, we see two distinct hands of two shades, lifted as if to interject. This pairing conjures the words of early abolitionist and suffragist Sojourner Truth when speaking about the various ways women walk the line of the movement, saying that women's fates were linked, but not because they were the same. Megan Jacobs presents us with a glass of water, just over half full, egg submerged, in front of a sweet floral sheet, referencing reproductive rights and a woman's right to choose. Joni Sternbach expresses the labor, love, endurance, and vulnerability of being a mother, her image speaking to the body, a vessel that provides and gives nourishment to the next generation. In Manjari Sharma's image, we see hands intertwined behind colorful cellophane, an ambiguous and symbolic representation of uncertainty, as this piece is so aptly entitled. And Carla J. Harris brings up associations concerning US history and the Constitution, the education system, the Pledge of Allegiance, and ultimately gives us a kind of hope that one day we may reach a more perfect union.
We've been really fortunate to have had the work seen in different formats already. In August, Indiana University hosted a screening of the slideshow across their campus for Equality Day. Shannon Thomas Parrish, who is the curator of the photographic history collection in the Smithsonian's National Museum of History, highlighted the project very early on in the NPR picture show. It was very, very exciting. In addition to the show at UNM, we're opening an exhibition and exciting program with the Colorado Photographic Arts Center in Denver this coming month. Other virtual displays are being planned for Old Dominion University in Virginia, Vincennes University, Indiana, Boston University, TCU, Truman State, and many others that have shown interest in hosting the work in some capacity. We are honored to be in discussion with the University Press to publish a book of the work, and are grateful to Lisa Volpe from the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, who has already written a timely piece for the introduction. In her essay, she quotes the late Congressman John Lewis: "Freedom is not a state, but an act that requires not only political process, but also art and poetry." And then if anybody has questions, I think this is where we'll stop for that.
It would be great if people can turn on their screens. It'd be great to see from you. And if you would like to pose a question either verbally or in the chat, that would be awesome. Should we stop sharing the screen, or do you want to keep sharing the screen? I'm just wondering, like, it's up to you guys.
It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, we could stop, it's fine.
Yeah, we can get back in the convo mode. Okay, stop share. Oh wow, there's a lot of people here. Hey everybody.
What questions do you guys have about the work? I have a question to kick us off. Maybe people can be thinking about what they would like to pose. I'm wondering, you know, Meg, you mentioned that you teach in a kind of interdisciplinary environment. The Honors College is very interdisciplinary, and I'm wondering how you and Francis see this as an interdisciplinary tool, or if you see it as an interdisciplinary tool that can be used as an educational tool.
Oh, Meg, you're muted.
Thanks. I think from the very beginning, we always wanted the project to be an archive, and we wanted it to live in virtual space. We wanted it to be sort of democratized, so anybody who has an internet connection or access to a computer or a cell phone could be able to see the information that was presented to them. But in terms of education, you know, we see it being used in every field. I mean, it touches upon so many various disciplines. I mean, from poli-sci to constitutional law, women and gender studies, art history. And so, say for instance, at my own institution, we have a graphic designer. Her name's Shelley Peterson. She's great. And she's using the archive as a way to get her students to interface with work digitally, but also in order to create projects using the work as inspiration. So that's how we've always sort of seen it from its inception, as something that will live and be able to be used in many different forms and in ways to start various conversations. Yeah.
To elaborate on that, I'd be so curious to see how 2020 is explained 100 years from now, and who is responsible for reporting that history. And I've always been drawn to the idea, the conversation of looking at the source of information that that people are posting, especially now in this like really social media oriented world that we live in. looking at sources of the people you disagree with, but then also the people that you trust, right? There needs to be a balance because there is a potential bias in all media. And I think it's our responsibility to be aware of the inconsistencies there. And releasing a project like this into the world of over 100 women in a typically male-dominated field gives me hope that a document like this with varied viewpoints will be referenced 100 years from now, or even 10.
I see some questions in the chat. Question she asked, do you have a favorite piece from the collection, and why? Is it your favorite?
So this is really funny because we were asked this question by Megan, who writes for the Daily Lobo, and we had not prepared by any means to answer the same picture, but we did. And it's Marina Font's photograph that she hand stitched with the quality and the wings. And we both were kind of like, oh my God, I cannot believe because there's like 400 some images, right? And to like both pick the same one. And then we both had very different reasons. So I'll let Frances elaborate, and then I could talk a little bit more, but yeah, I'll let you go.
It's so funny. Meg and I have been working together over a year and a half on this, and we haven't been in the same room at all to even kind of have these discussions, which is kind of surreal in its own way. But the fact that we're both drawn to Marina's image, like I look at that and I see her as this like phoenix rising up, and the relationship of the female body put in this really powerful position with the banner of equality across it too is like, of course we should be looking at women as these like powerful beings. And that picture, it has always stung in my mind as something, the incorporation of the flames and the head and the wings. There's so much there to hold on to and to feel proud of.
Yeah, and I think even just like referencing the history of photography, right? Like the male gaze upon the woman, thinking of Edward Weston and in the desert, photographing these ladies and they're naked in the sand, preferably. But so just like her taking that back, I mean, taking the female body back and like turning it on its head and saying, this body is my own. And then, thinking about like reproductive rights or various other issues, so I love how it sort of references that, like our historical male gaze, taking it back. But yeah, that's a good question.
There's another one. Susan, thank you for being here today. Has the question, do you have any future plans for this group of women photographers, another subject or project, now that they have come together? Great question.
That's a good question. So when we decided to call it a Yellow Rose Project, it was because we were thinking in the future, we don't want this to be the only thing that we do. And we would love to do more collaborative projects in the arts with women in the future. But we hadn't necessarily thought per se about collaborating with these particular women in the future. We thought in the future, we would love to have other voices and maybe even other people a part of like the jurying process. We kind of did that as well with this project, but like inviting other people so that it's just like it just builds upon itself, and you have more and more women, represented across the country, and maybe even for different projects. But yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, so far, I'm sure they would all love to do it, but we haven't thought about that. So good. Thank you, Susan.
Megan Jacobs is part of this group of women who had created work, but then also brought up this opportunity to show at UNM and do the programming there. And I think like that really enhances how this project will be brought out into the world, to have your voice, to be on a different side of it too, to bring it to your students, to your university, I think is really special. And we're going to be seeing more of that as time goes on.
I just wanted to say a quick thing, and then I see more questions in the chat. I just wanted to recognize that I was able to make my work because of an Honors Research Institute grant, and I was also able to work with students, and one of them is here today, Hanju Blumel, and I just wanted to thank all the students for their collaborative work and their incredible insights. It was really a collaboration and a partnership, and I feel like they brought innovation to the project, and it was just awesome to work with them. So thank you for being here today. I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any comments or questions? Hanju?
Hello, everyone. I'm Hanju. I helped work on the project with some of the other students, and I think a lot of what has been discussed today held true with our group and wanting to explore a lot of these issues and topics, and being able to work with some other students. I hadn't really even met a lot of the others. I think we were able to show a lot of different perspectives on this, and I actually hadn't seen any of the images that were shared today for all of the other participants, and it's really incredible and moving to see how they act as a collective in seeing the themes that we were discussing appearing in other works.
Thank you. So I see some Ailey says, amazing work. How do you share the images again? Is it a gallery, physical, or virtual? Sort of all of those, right? There's the virtual representation. So if you go to, and I can put this in the chat, ayellowroseproject.com, you can see all the works on a really amazing website. And then it's also, there are physical exhibitions that can be viewed in person, like on View and Honors, like behind me is a picture of that. And then also, it's also going to be in a book soon. So kind of all those different formats. And where can we access them? Alexis asked, great question. I'm gonna put that in the chat so you guys can look at that. Do you know the general, another question from Michaela, do you know the general age range of those who sent in work? I think it'd be interesting to see work sent in by young adults and teens. Were there any that young who participated?
I think 20s, it's like early 20s was like, I think the earliest or the youngest. And I think in terms of definitely 70s. Yeah, yeah. So it's quite a large age range, which I think is really nice. But yeah, I think that is such, I mean, whoever said that, such a good suggestion. I would absolutely love to see how young people, young women, because I think that we don't give, you know, younger folks enough credit for really being aware of what's going on. I mean, think about March for Our Lives, right? It was all younger people, or even any of the protests this summer. It's just like tons of young people out on the streets, right? So I think it would be amazing to see their response to something like this and all the various myriad of issues, you know. It's a really cool suggestion.
There's another question. Have you run into any issues with people who may disagree with the ideas expressed in the works? For example, reproductive rights, etc.
No.
Yeah, it's funny. I wonder if it was put in a outside of an educational institution, like if we were to put it, or say I live in New York City, if we were to put it on a monitor in the street, how people would react, and like hearing the text and the processes behind these photographers. I feel like how it's been presented in these kind of safer places. And I actually never really looked at NPR to see if there were comments on the article, which I'm gonna do right after we hang up here. Because you know, it's like when you give people those opportunities to voice their thoughts, most oftentimes they will, which is all part of this project too, where it's like we have this freedom to say what we want and vote for what we believe in, and that it goes both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, the First Amendment, it's sort of makes it so everybody can do that. And I think it would be, we've always been interested in conversation that the work would generate in various spheres, whether those are overlapping or not. So we haven't yet encountered people who are interested in having those conversations, but I mean, we would be open to them. It would be interesting to see with the artists too, their responses.
Are there other questions? Feel free to put in the chat, or you can just verbally ask if anyone has questions. I think you've touched upon this a little bit, but I wonder, I have a question that I want to ask a little bit about how some of the themes that have been brought up in the collection as a whole sort of map onto larger socio-political discussions in the US that are happening right now. Do you see specific pieces that are sort of inroads to these like larger dialogues?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know that like specifically. I just think about like issues, back at the turn of the century, things that like women really cared about in order for them to even want to go out and acquire the right to vote. It's after the war, during Reconstruction, and women want certain things to happen that affect their daily lives. So that's whether it's like, food quality, like there was spoiled milk at the turn of the century and all these children were dying. So they wanted like regulation over food. There's a juvenile court system that was a mess. So they wanted stuff like that, child labor laws. The reason that they wanted the vote is because they wanted to be able to make decisions they thought were really important. A lot of those like really did affect like their bodies and also them being mothers and in various spheres. And I think what to me is interesting about what's going on right now, it's like, it's so similar. The reason that we should all care about voting, the reason that we should all go out and vote is because there are all these things that are affecting our daily lives. And, that runs the gamut, from like specifically speaking at institutions like tuition and education, access to that, healthcare, things that affect our children. So I think it's interesting because there's a lot of stuff that was going on then to keep women from voting that is specifically coming up now again, and came up during the civil rights movement. And we're seeing like massive changes in terms of like, Supreme Court decisions affecting the rights of people of color, and so being able to vote and voter suppression issues. And I think, none of these issues have really gone away. And I think in various ways, metaphorically, poetically, symbolically, in so many different ways. I don't know if I can point them out, but all of the women are sort of speaking to that. They're pulling from archives, or they're talking about like present lived experience and how particular laws will affect them. It's like, during all of my research, I find out that there's particular states that have laws about the number of children you can bring to the polls. I mean, there's literally a law that says like you can only bring so many kids to go vote. And to me, I'm like, okay, so is somebody going to choose between daycare and voting? Or, and especially during this time of COVID and all of these issues coming up with UPS postal system and mail-in ballots and purging. I mean, there's just so much, but there's specific laws and things that are happening right now that are specifically geared towards suppressing the woman's vote. And, regardless of what side people fall on, I think it's our priority to go out and exercise that right, but it's an interesting thing. But I do think that the work definitely, all of the artists are speaking to these various issues, Yeah.
Thank you. That was a really wonderful response. Very thorough. Any other questions? Well, thank you both so much for joining us here today. It's been such a delight, and thank you for just sharing this incredible work and this vision for this project. I really, just to echo what Susan brought up earlier, I hope that you continue to do these large scale projects. I think that they really powerful and meaningful.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think even just like being in this conversation, or just preparing for this lecture, we saw so many different kinds of cool connections, and it helps us to understand the work even better, you know, so it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for allowing us to go through that exercise.
Thank you so much for having us and continuing the conversation. It's
Thank you.
an
Thank
honor
you.
to be hosted here at the
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a few more messages in the chat for you guys.
Oh, sure.
Oh, thank you. This is very nice.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you.
Appreciate you all.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks.